Think about the last time you selected a video to watch on YouTube. What was it that got your attention? Maybe it was the thumbnail, but I bet the headline did the trick. These days, we usually call these kinds of headlines clickbait. But clickbait's a little bit trickier when it comes to news. Sorry, news. Unlike commercials or TV shows or YouTube videos that use clickbait, news headlines still, even today, are attached to the idea of fact. So when you click on the news when you're watching YouTube and you hear something like this.
In other words, with identical scores, an African-American applicant was 4 times as likely to be admitted as an Asian purely because of appearance.
You don't immediately question whether what you're watching is true or false. It's the news. It's easy to assume that what you're hearing are facts. Today I'm going to build on a lot of the concepts that I discussed in an earlier video about propositions. This will help you make sense of some of the controversy that comes up whenever Asian Americans are discussed in the media. I want to discuss the topic of Asians and money, or more specifically, what it is that a lot of people assume about Asians when it comes to money. I want to do this by explaining how we got from here to here. But in order for me to do this, we have to start with understanding what makes an argument an argument. This is Zara Kessler. She used to be an editor for Bloomberg News, where she focused on, digital strategy? So why am I supposed to listen to what she thinks about Asian men? And no, the fact that she's white has no bearing on today's discussion, not any more than the fact that the women she's speaking to happen to be Asian.
Right, could be Korean Bolivian or Chinese American, for instance.
Right.
In fact, let's not focus on any of these individuals at all. Let's focus on the argument. Kessler is trying to explain why Asian men make the highest hourly wage in the US. Let's start with the word argument. This word doesn't immediately describe what you're seeing or hearing here at all. Everyone seems to be quite calm and relatively at ease. The term argument in logic doesn't refer to a dispute. It has a different definition. Whenever I use the term argument, we're talking about this connotation. Arguments are specific ways of communicating information so that someone can decide whether they agree or disagree with the information they're presented with. What is it about an argument that allows someone to do this, to be able to disagree or agree with information placed in front of them? Well, an argument is not a question or a command. This isn't an argument because it's not intended to prove anything. That's the key characteristic of an argument. It's a set of statements formulated together to prove a point of view. This is Kessler's argument. Keep in mind that an argument can't be a single proposition. All arguments have to contain at least 2 propositions. The reason for that is because some propositions work to support another proposition. That proposition that's being supported, that's what we call a conclusion. And each of the propositions supporting the conclusion is called a premise. Let me go back to the analogy of a table. An entire argument is like a table. The premises are like the legs of a table, and these propositions support the larger tabletop. You can think of that tabletop as the conclusion of an argument. So now you understand that in the same way a strong table is supported by proper legs, a strong conclusion is supported by proper premises. The stronger the table, the stronger the argument. Let's take a look at one of the tables that Kessler's building.
You might think, who's going to be at the top of this? White men. Right. But it actually turns out that Asian men outpace white men.
Kessler says that Asian men are outpacing white men by a huge margin. In fact, she refers to white men a lot in her report.
Paired with $21 for white males. So Asians are more likely to have a bachelor's degree or more. They're also than whites, and they're also more likely to have an advanced degree than whites. $35 in 2015 for Asian men compared to $32 for white men.
So how do we know that Asian men are really outpacing everyone if Kessler only really refers to white men? It's also important for you to note the table in front of you. Where do you see the data about the income of white men? It's not on here. We just have to infer this information. We have to go ahead and infer that Asian Americans are earning more than everyone else simply because they're outpacing white men. And all of this because we have to assume that white men are making more than everyone else, even though we don't see the data on the table. This is what's called an assumed premise. The argument only makes sense if you're able to fill in this missing information. It's assumed to be true, and you have to make sure that everyone knows that before you can continue proving your argument. There are a lot of assumed premises that Kessler uses to support her conclusion, which is what makes this video so difficult to watch from an Asian American studies perspective. For instance, we're supposed to assume that whatever is provided in this chart is true. And in order to do that, we also have to assume that the method used to compile the data here has been conducted properly. We'll get back to that in a little while. But let's focus on the argument itself for now. One of the reporters say that Asian men are outpacing everyone because Asians have higher rates of educational attainment.
I'm not quite surprised here because, pay has a lot to do with education, and the fact is that we have lots of highly educated Asian people. So what does this have to do with that?
Again, we're assuming that if Asians have higher education than whites, then they must have more education than everyone else. That's just an assumed premise. Then Kessler goes on to state this proposition.
You actually look at it, you can look at those 25 and older with at least a bachelor's degree, and those workers, and when you look at their median hourly earnings, you still actually see that Asians are ahead.
Look at these two propositions. Which of these two propositions support this conclusion? Well, one certainly relates more to the conclusion. This proposition doesn't have anything directly to do with the conclusion. It's about education. The conclusion's actually talking about hourly wages. For this premise, you need something else to arrive to get to this conclusion. You need an assumed premise to get there. Now you're starting to understand that every argument isn't the same. Some arguments are different in terms of being weaker or stronger, just like tables. If we were to take Kessler's words for granted, her argument sounds really solid. This is one of the most interesting things about arguments. Even though the premises aren't facts, the argument could still sound really strong. Think about it. If someone makes more money than someone else, and that person makes more money than everyone else, then this person here makes more than everyone. Simple. But notice that the argument is about hourly wages. It's not about total gross income, which includes health benefits, other perks like stock options, or even the total amount of hours worked. So we can't assume that if Kessler's data is correct, that this is the same as this, even though that's what's being inferred by this entire video. If you don't believe me, just look at the comments. So why is it that we infer that Kessler's saying that Asian men make more money than everyone else when that's not what she's really arguing? Well, it's because of messages like this.
Turns out that Asian men outpace white men.
By a huge margin, too. That's
why you have to use a lot of critical thinking skills when you watch the news. It's not enough to check the facts. You have to break down the argument itself. When it comes to Asian Americans, the news rarely gives you any context to understand the facts. Instead, most people in the media just cherry-pick information, just like Kessler did, from the very same report that I analyzed earlier. So when you take a good look at the table that she built, well, she kind of tells you for herself.
And that's one big caveat with all of this. Obviously, the Asian American population is very diverse, and if you're talking about various different groups, Korean versus the Hmong population, you're going to see don't have it in the data here, but it's likely that you're going to see a lot of different outcomes.
Not a great table. You can see just how easy it is for false information to become fact, especially in the news. What's difficult is finding out what information is fact for yourself, and learning how to establish your own point of view so that you can decide what you believe.